Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our next session titled The One About Control. Please help me welcome our speaker, Shri, Deputy CISO at Genpact, to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for making it here. I stand between you and Alicia Keys. I know, tough job, right? She has a tough act to follow, isn't it? I take it that way. There's apparently some sort of similarity between two of us. We were born in the same month. Beyond that, I can't near match her skills on stage. So you have to do with me for today. My name is Sriram. I go by Shri. Make it easier for everybody's life. What I'm going to share today is my opinion. I would not like it to be attributed to the employer, past, present, or future. But I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the session. And what's with the title? Some people say titles don't matter. Sometimes they do, right? I'm assuming the presence that I have in the room here also got intrigued with the title. The One About Controls. It does have a inspiration, if I can say that, from one of the very famous television series, mostly in the States, right? And I'm hoping some of that humor might rub off. If I don't, please raise your hand, yell at me, scream at me, and we'll have a conversation. The second part, there's a camera right there. I'm told there may be an option that you may get called for Hollywood or some other roles. If you engage with me, maybe I'll take you up with that role as well, right? All right, thank you so much for making it here. I'm going to start here. We've already covered the disclaimer. Now, in the late 30s and early 40s, Abraham Maslow came up with the idea of what does the human get motivation with. The idea sprang around the fact that everybody behaves, thinks, needs differently, and that is determined by either the circumstance or the current need to fulfill something, some real thing or some aspirational things. Now, in his mind, everybody wants to make sure that their safety needs are done first, right? You need your home, you need your shelter, you need your food. Beyond which is where you want to go to the fancy cars, right? So that's the principle of how I thought about thinking about controls as well. When you think about controls, there is a huge list of things you can do and want to do. But then, what you really need is something that is determined either by your circumstance or by the fact that it's a need for your business or by the fact that it's something that you like. It may not be required for the company. Does happen. I'm sure some of you may appreciate that context. Now, Abraham Maslow also thought about, in his original 1943, I believe, depiction as a pyramid, like the one that I was showing you. But I'd like you to think about it differently. All of us have phases in life. We go up and down. Imagine yourself plucking the fruit from this tree. If you're in a pyramid format, do you think you're going to get the fruit from every level? Probably not, right? The ripest fruit usually is also on the bottom, right? That also gets plucked the fastest. Think about it this way. So you go up and down in life. You go up and down in adjusting your controls as well. That is the premise I'm going to share with you with some of my thoughts. All right. If you've been to London, imagine that wonderful weather and meet Anna. Recently born, right? Anna grew up and was born into a very affluent family, the richest in the London. She grew up she kind of grew, had stuff that she needed. She made sure, her parents made sure that she had the education she needed. Remember, she's affluent, but her need to prove herself to the world was immense. That drove her to do studies in law. She became a very prominent lawyer over her journey of life, right? But then, after a certain point, money, fame, the fancy cars, the fancy house probably don't make enough sense. You probably need to make sure that the self-actualization kicks in. You want to give back to the society, and that's where she was. She went ahead and made a point to give back to the society by being pro bono to a lot of these social causes back in London. I want you to keep this thought with you for a moment and then say hello to Ramamurthy. Say hello. We also call him Rama. This chap grew up in a city called Bangalore back in India, which is where I am from, not very far from this chap's house, driving distance. Now, Rama wanted to be doing something very different in the space of, it's a startup culture. Standing in front of you in Bay Area, not talking about startup is going to be like crime, I guess. So Rama wanted to establish something of a startup product, and in the city of Bangalore. The conditions are different, the city is different, the ecosystem is different, but not really. So he wanted to establish himself as a player in the cloud. He figured out a problem that accounts payable that companies need to do aren't sufficient, and he wanted to make sure there's a product to do just that, and that's what he figured out and went about. Now, he wanted his website to have a certain set of features. He wanted to make sure it's accessible to his B2B customers, and those features were making sense to them. And that's how he grew. He made sure he made enough millions and sort of set on his journey to make the product a success. So we'll come back to him in a bit. At some point, these two stories merge. And no, I'm not talking about any matrimonial connections here. The two stories come together because Rama went global, and he needed a global lawyer. Say hello to Anna. All right. Now, coming back to the core of the topic, controls. I'd like to define controls as something that you run, manage, direct, or restrain to a certain desired outcome, right? Now, they are needs, like we were discussing earlier. Some are real, you need them, or some are aspirational. You probably don't need them, or maybe not just now. It's an idea whose time may not have come. I'd like to think about the controls in a life cycle format, and that's what I'm going to share with you. Think about the life cycle where it starts with identification of controls and goes through a process of selection, implementation, its validation, and its refinement, right? So there are regulations that can impact. There's supposed to be an animation here, by the way. NIST standards such as NIST can come about and influence that. Your decision to choose ISO series, for example, can influence that, or the standards like PCI, DSS, and so on. Okay, now it comes. I spoke ahead of myself, I guess. The cool thing to remember here, that there will be some intersection. The size is not a representation of the intersection. Okay, it's just visual that I wanted to convey to you, that most of these standards, most of these requirements will overlap. Okay, just bear that in mind. All right, so once you have this set of controls you wish to acquire or wish to work on, you may want to classify them in some form or fashion. Humans like to keep things in some structure, isn't it? So that's the approach that I'm going to propose to you. You could go it by domains that are commonly known in the cyber world, like identity and access. You could do the rest of the others, like perimeter, do it on the cloud, do it by physical security, and what have you. Don't forget the human element there. But don't forget the process there, right? The element of controls that you need in a process, and we'll soon discover why that's relevant, will become important for the overall functioning to the business objective of the control structure. All right, you may also, the world famous cybersecurity framework, version 2, NIST, adapt to that. I'm not expecting you to read this visual, but essentially choose a method that you find fit. All right, I also want to think about controls in some sort of a structure again, such as controls have domains, domains have subdomains, and those subdomains have control objectives, one or more. Each of those control objectives by itself may have one or more control statements. Each of those control statements by itself will have some requirements or configuration elements. All right, now here comes Rama again, right? Remember, he is starting his business, he is establishing his, is going global. He wants to do a little bit of, choices. So what did he do? Let's say we stick to the domain of identity and access management. He chose these 3 areas. Obviously, these are examples. The last bottom box there indicates there are more choices. We're just going to stick to 2. Let's say he focuses on authentication and authorization. If we pick up the authentication, these are the three choices of control objectives we're going to cover today. One is making sure that when he makes his app available to consumers or businesses, he wants individual to have unrestricted access or due access. And then he wants to make sure that accounts are kept safe. I shouldn't be able to access this gentleman's data, for example, right? For that, he wanted to make sure that while this happens, the authentication method should meet complex password requirements. That is his vision. And for that, there are some more requirements which are more specific to, okay, A, B, and C control elements configuration-wise. Okay, and authorization-wise, let's say he goes and talks about multi-factor authentication. All right, having chosen what he wants to, like regulations, like ISO series, these are his choices, mind you. Your choices may be different. He thinks that threat intelligence is important for his universe of controls, or the MITRE framework, or CIS for that matter. By the way, I do not represent any of these organizations, right? And if you look at that section, maybe he wants to focus on what the regulators and the customers need, what the company's objectives are. Remember, he wants to go global, he wants to make big money, and wants to make sure his applications is successful, and the culture element of it. There is another constraint in this ecosystem. Not enough capability or capacity will be available, isn't it? There is just going to be enough amount of money to put in. So that capability and that capacity becomes relevant. And for me, what's important in this choice is what the focus should be. Of course, the dollars. If you don't have the dollars, there's none of it is going to be true. So how does he go about selecting some of them? So let's say, we'll take 4 examples. Let's say from the regulation space, he says, the process reports that the operations generate shall need to be secure, right? He says the ISO standard tells him to have multi-factor authentication. Or for that matter, the threat intel requires digital rights as a measure to be introduced for his company's brand. And finally, from the MITRE framework, relevant application input controls are required. Remember, this is payment application, right? So he found it fit to implement or choose that, select that. But remember, we spoke about capacity, capability, and cost. All 4 were not possible for him, so he chose these 3. Okay, having chosen, somebody has to go and do the job now, and that's the piece where I come to the configuration element here. Okay. If I'm going too fast, you can raise your hand and let me know. So let's say if we distill the regulations part, the process controls to be relevant and secure, he chose these 2 elements of broad contours of how he thought about it, right? And I spoke about culture just a few minutes ago. Remember, one of his choices from the culture element is he wants to make sure that the outbound emails are screened. You may argue that that's a technical control, but that's also a control of how the operation of the fabric, the fabric of the company's culture wants to be built, right? He may choose not to screen, depending on the customer's contract, etc. But in this case, he makes the choice to screen. He also makes the choice that multi-factor is required, but not for all, right? He wants his business user to go ahead and access the website whichever fashion they want, like you may be using your public available webmails today. But for his IT staff, he wanted a step up. He wanted a certain degree of higher assurance of controls. And he chose not to go with his digital rights, remember? And these were the 2 elements that will not happen if he doesn't choose this. So that's a conscious decision he's making in the context of implementing those controls. And when you're looking at application, the larger part of the behavior, you don't want your customer to see a 404 page not found, right? You want to make sure that all the exceptions, all the input validation, all the attack vectors that are, let's say, on the SQL injection side, etc., are handled well. Most of them, if you cover by input validation, you're kind of likely to be more safe than sorry. So that's the piece that he focuses on. All right? You've chosen the controls. You've implemented the configuration. Now's the time to test. How many of you drive the car here, right? All of you, I guess. Once you've pass the test, you would at some point want to make sure that once you've taken the exam, and you would at some point want to make sure that you're really driving it well. That's where your DMV comes in, I guess. The validation part, therefore, looks at, is the stated objective being met or not met? So we'll see some of those examples. Here it's important to think about what is it that we're going to test. What is the real exposure going to be? What is the customer or the regulator actually influencing that decision with? Are there any certifications that are impacted with the choices we've made? Again, the capacity question, right? There are going to be, for example, the CIS and the NIST, for example, have thousands of controls. Are you going to be able to test all the thousands at a certain periodicity? The answer is going to be no. With automation, without automation. And then there are other elements of, okay, there could be some element of where the posture, where the element of configuration can be automatically determined, external surface, what have you, and what do they tell you? But then it is important to make sure that all of the assimilation of the choices you've made, the control's success or failure, is appropriately reported. If any of you are familiar with the PDCA cycle, that's what this is kind of going to, right? Now remember, it's important that these results are consumed by the other teams within the organization, whether it is IT, threat intel, or the defense mechanisms. Otherwise, you'll have a control that may work or may not work, but the other hand does not know how the whole thing comes together. So that's important. Now, having talked about it, what do we measure then, right? We've spoken about validation, but then validation throws out some numbers, validation throws out some measures, but how do we bring about the story to be like numerically or presented to the right layers of management? So you could go with any of these. There are just an example, sets of examples. You could go as deep as behaviors, determining behaviors and talking through it, but then some of it are more obvious, like how many accounts have MFA or don't, how many accounts have privilege or don't, and so on and so forth. And like we said, if you remember the top bar there, they were the same domains we chose earlier on the slide 3 or 4, right? Now, in my mind, Metrics 101 is all about making sure it's relevant to the audience. The so what should be more focused on, and that's where the journey will come from. It needs to connect to a business objective. The objective that Rama had to make sure that his website has a certain amount of reach, a certain amount of revenue coming out from it, that's the central focus of how the objective needs to be met with the controls he's chosen. And therefore, the performance of that control mechanism is how the objective will be met. Now, there are other things that I call 3 C's, which is clear, consistent, and concise. The metric needs to be repeatable from the same set of data, otherwise it's not reliable. The metric needs to be arriving at the same inference, right? If 2 people look at the same sets of data, the presentation layer may change, but the analysis should not ideally change. And again, I personally believe that this is a pretty important element of formatting. The element of how the data is presented is important. Think for yourself. When you go and buy an Apple product in a very well-lit, wide, beautiful showroom versus a mom-and-pop shop somewhere down the street with some other brand of the phone, which one are you likely to choose given that you may have the same amount of money, right? The chances are that you'll gravitate to a better brand. And that presentation is important. And again, I don't work for Apple. And then, like I said, business objective and therefore the outcome driven. So they're like corresponding layers of the metric. Now think about all of this will generate hundreds and tens and gigs of data. It'll also generate a lot of value that has to be told. The story has to come out. But everybody thinks about that number differently, right? If you talk about the layer in the management, the strategic layer wants to look at the data in a different set. The tactical layer or the mid-management wants to look at it with a different layer of lens. And the operational guy needs far more detail to hands and keyboard work on it, right? What I've tried to depict is the ladder, because you go up and down the choice. And then remember that the details on metric largely are more as you grow up, go on the right of the ladder, which is you have tactical and the operational layers. And if you go strategic, it's very, very unlikely that you'll need too much detail. There may be some detail-oriented senior management folks as well, but then it's easier to build that story there. In my view, here are some examples, right? Like I said, the CXO layer looks at the big picture, the mid-management plans about, okay, here are the problems to fix, here's what the metric is telling me, what do I need to do? And then the practitioner actually goes about doing so. And again, in my opinion, these are 5 dimensions I chose to bring to the management layer, where our desired control is, which is in the dark blue line, and where our current status is, because the controls may have not worked as optimally as you want, based off cost, based off capacity, or even time, right? For example, I'm assuming people here know that you can really patch every machine every single time a patch comes out, isn't it? The answer is no. And that gap could be a function here, right? All right. The mid-management layer may want to know a little bit more than that spider graph. I favor the spider graph. I like that representation. But the bar graph will tell you, hey, when I examine the control on this app or that app or these APIs, here are the 3 or 4 control gaps that we found. Here is the depth of issues that we found that may not have been sufficient, right? So this information is then consumed in a much more detail by the next layer, which is the tactical layer. Sorry, the operational layer. Here, if you see, it has far more detail than also the choices to be made. For example, in this case, the application 2, where the controls were validated, tested, is going to be decommissioned in a certain time frame. Therefore, some of these controls are not going to be remediated. That's an information the practitioner needs to know, because he doesn't need to spend or she doesn't need to spend time on that. And that's where the magic comes from in terms of prioritization as well. Okay. Now let's go back to having tested. Some action has already been generated. Some refinements will have to happen, right? Some control tweak, configuration element tweak will have to happen. So here's what influences some of those tweaks. Metrics like what we just spoke of, security incidents, external breathing. We come to forums such as this, know about lots of things, AI included, and that can influence what your refinement should be. I'm sure many of you have attended several sessions, keynotes, etc., and have taken some learning to take back to your organization. And that will also trigger some of these refinements. You may also look through your historical issues, historical risks, and then try to tweak based on the current capacity, capability, and cost. And then the technology changes. Now, everybody under this planet today talks about AI, right? So that change is going to trigger some refinement somewhere in your ecosystem. And finally, some of those threat intelligence feeds, like the way your attack vector or your threat actors are acting in your area of work or your vertical or your businesses, will trigger some more action. And that's the piece that I believe can lead to more refinements. That refinement that you have chosen now will also have to be implemented. So it's almost like a cyclical process. But think about it this way as well. When you refine a control, there may be a situation where you're upping some of the controls requirements, and therefore you're able to reduce some of the control requirements. Think about it this way. The example I have for you is, let's say you have your password set to be about 10 characters today. And let's say you increase that to 14. Once you do that, you may have an option based off all historical trends, threat intel, what have you, that you don't necessarily need to change the password every 90 days, isn't it? You may choose to do so 180 days or maybe, I don't know, 365 days. So that's the piece of refinement that you have to consciously think about, that the refinement may mean increasing or reducing. When I say reducing, I don't mean the efficacy of it. I only mean the depth of it or the level of it in that sense, right? Because there are enough compensating controls in the ecosystem to bring that about. All right, so let's now map it to Rama's areas of controls. So remember he chose these, and he chose threat intel not to be implemented, but based on the input he got from his threat intel, he now decides to refine them with including a DRP product and onboarding it for at least his execs, and then go forward with some of the other code repositories, because remember, he's a guy who builds code, builds applications. So some of those newly added controls are basically going to add to his control repository hereafter. Here for you is the whole story that I was trying to weave in whatever last 20 minutes. This is the life cycle, and that's the repository of controls that you can consider. That's again not a finite picture, you can have more, but I'd like you to make sure that you remember these 3 C's: capability, capacity, and cost. They will always be probably the influencing factor of what your choices are. They're also going to be influenced by I'm saying upbringing in a very loose term, essentially your circumstances, your choices of the environment that you may have experienced. All right, almost at the end. AI, as you can imagine, will disrupt. There are some methods that I think it will disrupt with, but then there are far more experts in this room and in the buildings that would have already spoken a million times about AI and how they're going to disrupt. So think about those assimilations for you and how those will drive the refinements in your areas of work. So that broadly is my positioning of what the one about controls is. And here's what I think you can take back. For you to make sure that you're making the right choices, focus on what your capability is, what your capacity is, and what your cost lever is. There is not going to be a finite answer. It's not, many of you may be from the security consulting business, right? There's a very common phrase that consultants use. Ask me a question. It may start with, well, it depends. And that's what this is at, right? So there's not going to be a finite answer to what controls should I choose? Well, I don't know. It depends. The control library, there's an example of it, like the CIS's repository. You can choose to use that. It has a pretty detailed one. There are other standards as well. I was listening into a session earlier today. There is apparently an open source forum where some of these standards are already correlated, so you can leverage that. You also need to be very cognizant and very conscious about the level you are at and where you want to be, the desired and the current level, right? And therefore, figure out what delta you need to do to refine your control environment and go forward from it. There is another framework from NIST called the OSCAL. It basically allows the assessment and the control to kind of talk to each other, basically using JSON and such. And that, I believe, will help you automate and do a lot of these control validation exercises much, much faster and more reliably, weeding out the manual effort there. In my mind, this will probably take you about 6 to 9 months. I don't have a breakup by 3 months to 9 months. Guess why? Because it depends. It's your choice. It's your organization. I can't dictate that. But those choices are available. However, the final piece that I'd like to share with you is oftentimes, and I've seen it enough in my life, that we forget the foundation. We forget the basic layers of controls. If you read up on any of these advisories and any of these information that's available on what the attack vector is doing, threat actors are doing, 9 out of 10 times, I bet you, it will be either a weak configuration that was supposed to be fixed before I was born and or weak passwords, right? Of course, these are just 2 examples, but largely people forget the basics. If you don't remember your ABCD, it's unlikely that you'll make a sentence that will be relevant for long term. So that's the piece that I'd like to leave you with and open it with questions. I think I'm super ahead of time, but questions, please. I don't want you to miss Alicia's. I'm just saying. Please.
Hello? Yeah, one thing that I think we end up doing in the industry is that we implement controls, but we don't retire them. I mean, I understand that refinement, it's like you put more money or less money, but the retirement of controls, I think
retirement of controls? Yeah, okay. So if you notice you said retirement, right?
Yeah, yes, yeah. I think it's very hard for human beings to get rid of stuff. Yeah,
so I bundled it in refinements as an example. The idea was that when the environments are supposed to be decommissioned, for me it was a function of refinement, because when you lessen the attack surface, remove the control requirement, that's a refinement for me, but fair point. I mean, we can elaborate on that as well. Thank you. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi. So in your example up there, there was basically one product that was being, controls were being established for. Say in an organization there's several different products, different teams. Do you see risk in trying to establish kind of a organization-wide
Yes.
set of controls?
Yes.
And what could those be?
Thank you for your question. But think about it like this. If you remember my bubble chart where there was a lot of controls and that intersection was depicted, think about that intersection to be your finite list of controls for the organization, most often, right? And then there will be a Delta app. For example, you want to do something more special for your AWS or for any of your cloud presence, and therefore you want to make it more stringent. Think about them as bolt-ons to your control library, applicable to a scope that is beyond the larger part of the enterprise ones, right? And that is definitely possible, and that's something you should do. But then again, the scoping question is again a function of capacity and capability, right? And that's the reason I was trying to connect it to the capability and capacity, because if you, like the example of multi-factor, right? Rama didn't choose to implement multi-factor for everyone. It was for a business purpose, but it's also for a reason of cost, maybe. So in that fashion. I hope that answers. Thanks. Cool. I don't have swags to give away for questions. All right. I think that's it. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Hope this was useful.